My kids know that if they are ever talking to me or to my wife, to Jenny, and they say to us, stop and listen, it doesn't matter what we are doing in that moment. We will stop whatever we are doing and give them our full attention. Now, I know that it probably shouldn't take them saying stop and listen to get us to truly pay attention and focus on them. And don't get me wrong, like I love my kids. I love talking to them. I love hearing them tell their stories, to share about how their day went. But when my kids are telling a story, imagine that you are watching the world's longest movie and you're about 5 minutes away from the ending of the movie when they realize that they left out a scene, and so the entire movie starts over again. Like that is my kids telling a story. In fact, I've got an actual photo of me listening to my kids, waiting for them to finish their story. This is me by the end, right? I mean, again, don't get me wrong. I love my kids. I love listening to their story, but if I'm honest, I can easily get distracted. I can get pulled away. I can find myself, beginning to do some housework, or to start fixing something in the house, or maybe I'm responding to a message. And so they know that if all they have to do is say stop and listen, and with those three simple words they can grab our attention, and whatever we're doing, we put whatever it is aside, we put that down to focus completely on them. That's kind of what is happening in Psalm chapter 5. David is praying this prayer, and as he's praying his prayer, he's essentially saying to God, would you stop and listen? I want you to focus on me. Will you listen to my prayer? Here's what he says in Psalm chapter 5, beginning in verse 1. Listen to my words, Lord. Consider my lament. Hear my cry for help, my King and my God, for to you I pray. In the morning, Lord, hear my voice. In the morning, I lay my request before you, and I wait expectantly. And so David, as he's praying, he says to God, listen to my words. Now, this word listen, some translations actually say give ear, is actually this Hebrew word that really kind of means the idea of to broaden your ear, right? So picture if you've ever been in a situation where somebody's talking and it's difficult to hear them, there's lots of other background noise going on, and you're really trying to hear what they have to say, and so maybe you kind of lean in and you put your ear towards them. You are taking a physical posture of listening. And that's kind of the idea here, the picture that David is painting. He's asking God, like, would you lean in? Would you listen and focus? Listen to my words, Lord. Consider my lament. Hear my cry for help. As David's praying this prayer, I almost picture, I don't know if you remember, but a few years back, there was this video that went viral of this little boy just asking Linda to listen.
You guys.
Okay, Linda,
listen,
Linda, listen.
Okay, what?
Like everything they do at this house, you can't trust everything at Grandma's house.
Okay.
Okay, then what?
Then you're not listening to me.
Then you're not listening to me.
I asked you not to do something.
Linda, but listen to me.
So that's kind of almost how I picture David in this prayer. Like, listen, God, listen. And he is just crying out to God, would you listen to my prayer? Listen to my lament. You get the sense that David, his heart's just breaking, and he wants to bring his prayer and lay his request before his God. And you begin to wonder, like, what gives David the audacity to be able to approach God like this? Like, what in the world gives David the confidence to come to God in this manner and just demand that God would listen to him, that God would lean in and focus on him? Well, as David continues his prayer, he goes on to begin to describe the very character of God. So he bases his appeal for God to listen on God's own character. He's praying, like, listen to my words, consider my lament. Then he goes on in verse 4, for you are not a God who is pleased with wickedness. With you, evil people are not welcome. The arrogant cannot stand in your presence. You hate all who do wrong. You destroy those who tell lies. The bloodthirsty and deceitful, Lord, you detest them. So David just paints this picture of the character of God, that we have a God who is a holy, just judge. We have a God who does not tolerate evil. He will not let evil go unpunished. And so he says of God and of God's character that you are a God who will not allow evil. You destroy evil and all who engage in it. And it's almost as if, based on this kind of quality of who God is, that David feels the boldness to be able to approach him, which seems a little counterintuitive, right? I mean, he's just described God as this just judge. In fact, for many of us, for our modern ears, this picture of who God is seems incredibly harsh. In a modern culture that values tolerance, this picture of who God is as a just judge who will not tolerate evil, who punishes evil, and will not allow evil into his presence seems incredibly harsh. But you know who doesn't find this picture of God harsh? Victims of injustice. You know, the child who has endured abuse at the hands of the people he should have been able to trust the most to protect him. The young girl who is trapped in sex trafficking. The parents who had to bury their own child because of a senseless act of violence. These are the people that they cry out to a God like this. They are crying for justice. They're calling out for it. And they don't find this picture of who God is to be offensive. Like, to them, this is a comfort to know that God does not let sin and evil and violence just go on without addressing it. And so David says, you, God, like, this is your character, this is who you are. And so what on earth would make him think that he could approach a God like this and ask this God to lean in and to listen to him and focus on him? The audacity of David. Well, in verse 7, we begin to see why exactly David thinks that he can get a hold of God and that God would lend him his ear. Here's what it says in verse 7. But I, by your great love, can come into your house. Well, hold on, David. Like, do you realize how bold of a statement that is? I mean, David just got done telling us that the very character of God is that he will not tolerate any evil wickedness at all. He will not tolerate sin. He will not let it go unpunished. And he's painted this picture of this just judge. And then he says, but I can come right into your house. What a bold statement on David's part. And don't forget that at this point in Israel's history, as David is praying this prayer, Israel all gathered at the temple to worship God. And the way the temple was structured is that in the center of the temple, in the center of this place, was the Holy of Holies, and that is where the presence of God dwelled, and nobody was allowed into the Holy of Holies. Nobody could approach God and come into his presence except only the high priest, and even then only once a year, after going through all these sacrifices to be able to go in and approach God and to represent the people to God and to represent God to the people. And so David, to boldly say, I can come into your house, like, where does David get off saying something like this, fully recognizing the character of God, fully recognizing how serious God takes sin? How could David possibly think that he could get a hold of God's attention? How could David possibly think that he could come right into God's house? Well, he tells us right there in the verse. But I, by your great love, that is the only way that David has any way into the presence of God. We do not simply force ourselves into God's house. No, we have access because he has invited us in. But by your great love, I can come into your house. By your great love. Jesus, in his own words, in John chapter 15, tells us that greater love has no one than this, that he would lay down his life for his friends. And then Jesus goes on in the very next verse and says to his disciples, you are my friends. He's kind of giving them a clue about the events that are to come, that he would lay down his life for his followers so that they might come into his presence. Jesus laid down his life in the greatest act of love so that we could come in to his presence and boldly approach him. Hebrews 10 verse 19 puts it this way. Therefore, brothers, since we have confidence to enter the holy places by the blood of Jesus. we can approach God in this way, in this manner, knowing He will lean in and give us His attention as our Father, because Jesus has done the work that allows us to be adopted as His children. And notice here that God doesn't just sweep our sin under the rug. I mean, we just saw in those first few verses how serious God takes sin. God doesn't sweep our sin under the rug. He doesn't just say, it's okay. There's something that we have often done with our children, that anytime that they get into an argument and someone has done something to one of their sisters, we always kind of go through this process of apology and how to accept that apology. And a lot of times, one of our daughters will say to the other one, I'm sorry for, and whatever it was they did. And the other daughter will look at her sister and say, it's okay. And we instruct our kids, no, it's not okay. Our proper response is say, but I forgive you. Right now, there's a difference there. We're not saying that action was okay. We're saying that it actually wasn't okay, but I forgive you. And that's the picture of what God has done for us in Jesus Christ. God is not saying that our sin is okay. He would never say to us as we come to Him, He would never say to us, it's okay. But He does say to us, I forgive you. And there is a huge difference in that. God does not let our sin go unpunished. We just saw that in David's description of God here. God deals with evil. He won't tolerate it. He destroys evil and all who do it. And yet, God has made a way to deal with our sin by taking the punishment upon Himself. And so David can, with confidence, approach God by His great love. You see, Jesus took the punishment upon Himself for our wickedness, dealing with our sin and our wickedness in the greatest act of love ever, so that we could enter into His house as adopted sons and daughters for all of eternity. And so how are we to respond to this kind of incredible demonstration of God's love? Well, look at what the rest of verse 7 says. David goes on to say, in reverence, I bow down toward your holy temple. In reverence, or some translations might say, in fear, I bow down. Now notice that David has just connected fear with God's love. By your love, I can come into your house. In reverence, I bow down. Shouldn't fear be connected back to where David described God as a God who punishes evil? David's not afraid in that way. He has this sense of, it's more of a sense of awe and wonder at who God is. And so instead of a fear that would drive away, it's a sense of awe that draws you into God. That because of His great love, we're left with the sense of awe that God would do this, and it draws us into Him. And it draws us into His presence. And so our response to this great love is one of submission and worship, and reverence and worship and awe. We approach Him. We worship Him. But it says, in reverence, I bow down. This is a posture of submission. This would be the position that someone would take before a powerful king. And so David is bowing down, laying prostrate before God as an act of submission to Him. The only way for us to respond to this great love is a response of submission to Him and worshiping Him. It's not about something that we must do, but it is about worshiping Him in response to what He has already done. So Christianity is not about a list of things that you have to do. It's about what Jesus has already done for you. So let me ask you, does your position before God reflect the truth of what He has done for you? It's not, the deal here is not what would Jesus do, but what has Jesus done. I know that for a while, especially back in the 90s, what would Jesus do? WWJD became very popular. And so there was this trend of, like, in every situation, you should ask yourself the question, what would Jesus do? And that became kind of the guiding principle for every moment of your life. But really, what should guide everything that we do, every moment of our life, should be influenced not by what would Jesus do, but what has Jesus done. Because of what He has done for me, I'm going to submit to Him and worship Him in every moment of my life. So, does your position before God reflect the truth of what He has done for you? We can boldly approach God, and we see it right here. David looks forward to the promise of the coming Messiah. We look back to what Jesus has done, that promise fulfilled, and because of that, we can boldly come to God and cry out to Him, listen, 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 God, listen, and know that He will turn His ear towards us and give us His full attention because of His great love. We can approach Him in this way, and then we approach Him with an attitude of submission and of worship. That is our response to this great act of love. And this is one of the ways that we see Jesus showing up here in Psalms, and in so many other Psalms. As you read through, you'll see this sense of, because of God's great love, that is the only way that we can come to Him in this act of worship and prayer. We can approach Him not because of anything we have done, but because of His great love for us that He demonstrates to us through the work of Jesus Christ on the cross. So over the last few weeks, we've been really kind of digging in of how do we read through the Old Testament through the lens of Jesus. And a couple weeks ago, what we saw is we can read through the law, through Leviticus and all these other places with all the laws. We can read the laws in the Old Testament through the lens of Jesus, recognizing that it points us to Christ because we can never fulfill the law. And then last week we looked at Judges and here in the history of Israel, how God sent these people to deliver them, but they were insufficient. They could not deliver Israel from what they needed delivered from the most. That was themselves. And it left us with this hunger for Christ alone, who can deliver us from sin and set us truly free from what we needed the most. The one great deliverer. And so we're left with this longing. And here in Psalms we see that now, because of what Christ has done, we have the ability to boldly approach God and to enjoy this relationship with Him, that we get to call Him Father. Next week, I want to encourage you as we wrap up this and really kind of begin to understand how do we do this throughout the whole Old Testament. We're going to look at one of the prophets. So next week, we're going to look at the story of Hosea, a prophet named Hosea, and his relationship with his wife Gomer, and how that paints a picture for us of what Jesus Christ did for us. So I hope you'll join us for that. Maybe spend some time this week reading Hosea for yourself as we come together and discuss that next week. Thanks for joining us. Let me pray for us as we wrap up tonight. God, we thank you so much for your grace and your mercy that you have shown us, that because of your great love that you showed us through Christ, that right now we can come to you boldly, knowing that you're listening to us, that you hear our prayers. And yes, God, we know that you are a God who takes sin seriously. And yet, even with all my sin, I can boldly approach you because of what Christ has done to overcome my sin, to take on the punishment of my sin for me. So, Jesus, I thank you for the work that you have done for me that allows me, that invites me into relationship with you. And I want to surrender all to you. We worship you and praise you for your love and your grace and your mercy that you have shown us. Pray this in the name of your Son, Jesus Christ. Amen.